This is Dr. Don Fowler in his teaching on Old Testament backgrounds. This is session number 21, Neo-Babylonian Empire and End of Judah.
Well, welcome back to all of you. This is our last day of taping here. It's a Friday morning, and want to say as I start this morning, it's been a real joy and privilege to have this opportunity to share with you on this tape, and especially to have the opportunity to be with my good friend Ted Hildebrandt, who is making all of this possible. So thank you so much for bearing with us, and we are leaving a significant era. It's the era of the first hyperpower, and it must have seemed to them like this would never end. After all, 3 centuries isn't exactly like 3 decades. So there were many generations who had never known anything but Assyrian domination. And now, just like that, in the absolute perfect set of circumstances, Assyria could be overcome. It could only have happened with a perfect set of circumstances. So what we have is a sort of alliance that was able to bring down this mighty Assyrian empire. And so that alliance was the Babylonian power to the south, in alliance with the Medes to the east. And if you could picture with me the topography to set the stage, here in the purple is the Mesopotamian Valley. And then separating Mesopotamia from Iran, or other names for it, is the Zagros Mountains. Then on the east of the Zagros Mountains area is the classic area of the Medes and the Persians. So the Babylonians forged an alliance with the Medes, and the Medes were the ones who actually were the prime people in bringing down the Assyrian Empire. They were also allied with a group of fierce horsemen who had joined themselves into this alliance called the Scythians. We think that they came from the Russian steppe. But between this alliance and the fact that that Assyria was disunited and deeply weakened, it was just the perfect time for this empire to come to an end, and so thus it was. So I must have clicked on the wrong document. So bear with me as I take a few minutes to get my material back. In this rising power now of Babylon, the world will take a shift, but nothing like it's going to take in 70 years when the Persians take over. So the Neo-Babylonian period is a period in which Babylon has been in a schizophrenic relationship with Assyria. The Assyrians regarded them apparently with some form of religious affection. They respected deeply Babylon's great religious past, especially because Assyria did not have a past that stretched into the 3rd millennium. So they respected Babylon, but the Babylonians didn't really appreciate the Assyrians in a like fashion. So throughout the the period in which these two political entities lived side by side, there was friction. So Nabopolassar is king of Babylon there at the end when the Assyrian Empire collapses. And so Nabopolassar is now, even though he's king of Babylon, I need to make the point that, and this is a marginalia, it's not like you have to have this down, but Babylonia now is part of an Aramaean-speaking entity that can properly now be called Chaldea. So the Aramaeans in the south were called Chaldeans, and the Aramaeans in the north tended to be called Aramaeans. So Nabopolassar was of Chaldean extract, which is nothing more than southern Aramaean. He assumed the throne of Babylon in 626, and that was in a time period when Assyria was in some state of dissolution. It appeared to be his alliance with the Medes that was the most influential in bringing down the Assyrian Empire. By 617, he had cleared the Assyrians out of Babylonia. After the last of the Assyrian forces had retreated to Haran, he attacked in 611, 610, and meanwhile a large Egyptian force had come north to try to aid Assyria. The two forces collided in 609, and evidently the Babylonians won that battle. Josiah, who was the last godly king on the throne in Judah, lost his life trying to stop Pharaoh from making his way north to assist the Assyrians. After being repulsed in the effort, but not by Josiah, the Egyptians remained in control of Palestine for several years. So I think it would be worth me pausing here to explain to you the surprising and chaotic turn of events that had occurred. When it became clear to the people in the ancient world, when it became clear that Assyria was in trouble, a strange set of new alliances began to occur. The Egyptians recognized that Assyria was weak, and so they decided to ally themselves with the Assyrians. Now, this is one of those who would have thought moments. No one could have predicted that the Assyrians would be trying to rescue that the Egyptians would be trying to rescue the Assyrians from the Babylonians. That's exactly what happened. So the Egyptians sent an army through the area of Israel all the way north up here, close to Haran, trying to help the Assyrians. And in 609, they're defeated. And so there's one last great battle to be fought in 605, and that's at the Battle of Carchemish. You can see Carchemish is here. So international politics make for interesting conversations in any era. So this new alliance, consisting of the Babylonians and the Medes, is far more powerful than this emerging alliance of Egypt and the remnants of Assyria. So, but lost in the moment is the sidebar of importance. King Josiah was a great and godly king, and as the Egyptian forces are making their way through here at Megiddo, which is not on this map, but at Megiddo, which there's a pass that goes through the Carmel mountain range, and historically, that is the pass that armies preferred to go through. And Josiah knew that, and so Josiah tried to stop the Egyptians, and there Josiah lost his life in battle. it must have been troubling to the Orthodox religionists of Judah to see a king who had led Israel in the most, or I should say led Judah, who led Judah in the most thoroughgoing religious reform of the entire period of the Old Testament, to lose his life in battle against an Egyptian pharaoh. This, of course, can be troubling, and just as we mentioned in our last tape repeatedly about how dangerous it is to build your theology from the front page of a newspaper, so now it must have been very difficult for them to interpret, what is God doing? One would have thought that Josiah would have given an opportunity for God to turn the corner with the Israelites. But in fact, Josiah's so-called revival wasn't really a revival. It was a reform imposed from the top. And unfortunately, the religious reforms of Josiah did not penetrate into the social echelons, the religio-social echelons of his country, Judah. So with the death of Josiah, it's not hard to say, it's just a matter of when the southern kingdom will come to an end. So to return, therefore, to our text, Josiah has lost his life, and the Egyptians are now in control of Palestine. After being repulsed in the effort, they remain in control of it for several years, during which they placed Jehoiakim on the throne of Judah. By now, friends, let me make the point to you that Judah is a much smaller player than what it had been just a century before. So it's not exactly like we should think Judah is the same that it had been. Well, after losing the battle at 609, Necho recoups, rebuilds, and marches north, and there in a mighty battle at Carchemish in 605, these two armies met. Evidently, the Egyptians were routed because another battle was fought at Hamath a year later, in which the Egyptian army was destroyed completely. With the way open to the gates of Egypt, it was likely that the death of Nabopolassar spared the Egyptian rout. After Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar, who was the son of Nabopolassar and the general of the army, crossed the great Arabian desert to return for his coronation at Babylon. Let me put my map back up so that we can all see what was going on. Here is the map situation. At Carchemish, and then the year after at Hamath, the Egyptian forces are repeatedly routed. And for all practical purposes, this is going to spell the end of Egypt as a powerful player. So after the Battle of Hamath, the forces here are now moving south, and Nebuchadnezzar gets down in this region. When Nebuchadnezzar hears that his father, Nabopolassar, who's sitting on the throne in Babylon, he hears that his father has died. Well, of course, this is a brand new dynasty, so he is anxious to get back to Babylon and have himself coronated before somebody else takes his place. So instead of going the safe and normal route like this all the way back to Babylon, he makes his way directly across the great Arabian desert, risking life and limb to get back to Babylon. And so there he's coronated and becomes one of the great kings of antiquity. So Egypt may or may not have had a brief moment of coming under Babylonian control, but if it did happen, it was relatively brief and not consequential. the core of the Babylonian Empire, unlike that of the Assyrian, was the Fertile Crescent. That's pretty much all it ruled. And Nebuchadnezzar becomes one of the great and famous kings of antiquity. So he sought to go directly into Egypt, but was repulsed, and then, as his military forces are moving down in the region, they do what empires had been doing for a very long time. They take hostages that they're going to train to go back and help sort of educate them in Babylonian ways and thought, and then to serve the Babylonians. So after the great battle of Hamat, as the forces of Nebuchadnezzar make their way south, important people like Daniel and Ezekiel and others are taken into Babylon to be trained to serve the Babylonians. So, such is the situation with Nebuchadnezzar, that he's now ruling, and I would dearly wish it was possible. This is not a History of Israel course, but I would love to go into the biblical text and talk with you about the last days of Judah. In 597, there was a revolt against the Babylonians. And I can't help but tell you, even at this late stage of my life, I find this to be little short of astounding. Judah is a tiny little country, not much larger than a county in a Midwestern state. They're weak politically, they're weak militarily, and to have them revolt against Babylon is truly astounding. And yet, that is exactly what happened. Nebuchadnezzar brings his forces to the west. They have the good sense to surrender. Nebuchadnezzar takes about 10,000 Judeans into captivity. And one would have thought that would have spelled the end, that Judah would now grasp its role, which is to be a slave nation to the Babylonians. Better to be enslaved to the Babylonians in your own country than to be enslaved and in Babylon. One would have thought that the revolt in 597 would have been enough, but such was not the case. In 587, 586, they revolt a second time. And it's a particularly interesting thing to read in the biblical text, because this revolt came not from above, but from below. The revolt led by Zedekiah reveals to us in the biblical text, Zedekiah knew what he was up against. And Zedekiah did not want to revolt against the Babylonians. He actually came to Jeremiah, or had Jeremiah come to him at night and talk with Jeremiah. Jeremiah had the mind of God, and he was telling them that, you're going to be destroyed unless you submit yourself to the Babylonians. But this is the Middle East, and maybe it's unwise to impose current religious tensions onto the past world. But the religionists in Judah, the religio nationalists, had convinced themselves that God was with them and God would be forced to deliver them. So they override Zedekiah's desires, And they force him into a revolt against Nebuchadnezzar. So, with that, Nebuchadnezzar brings his forces to the west, and after a relatively short siege, Jerusalem falls, and the population is now deported to Babylon. Zedekiah is a particularly tragic case because he was smart enough to know that this revolt had literally no chance. So when the Babylonian armies make their way into his territory, he takes his family with him, and they flee by way of the Dead Sea, and they're making their way south to Egypt. And there, the cavalry of Nebuchadnezzar catches him, and so they bring him back to Jerusalem, and there in front of whatever surviving elements of the city of Jerusalem were still there, they murder one by one every member of the family of Zedekiah, wives and children, and then they put Zedekiah's eyes out. Evidence, or with a purpose, so that the last thing Zedekiah will have ever seen is every one of his family members killed. They paid a very high price for this revolt against Babylon. So, as we look at this, it occurs during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, and of course Judah is a hiccup on the buffet table of the ancient world. It is inconsequential, but now, when we think back in our earlier comments about the promises made to Abraham, the land has been lost, the temple has been lost, the kings have been lost, and so now they have a rare opportunity to be a blessing to the nations because they will be in Babylon for 7 decades. This must have been a time of tremendous importance for the Jewish people. So, if you would allow me to just pause here with you for a moment. We can take for granted that they survived because we know they survived. But we need to pause ourselves and ask, how and why did they survive? None of the other peoples who were taken into captivity in the Assyro-Babylonian milieu survived. Yet here we have an unprecedented situation in which the people of God kept their identity, an identity in exile, and an identity that they perpetuated even when the remnant left Babylon and went back and refounded their country. That's what I mean when I suggest to you that very important religious activities were occurring in Babylon that are not visible in the biblical text. The Bible doesn't really tell us much about that 70-year period in exile in Babylon. But the exile did not end. It did not end for the vast majority of the Judeans. They never came back. When the exile is over, only about 50,000 return. So here's what we can say. They needed to reformulate their religious identity. And if I may be forgiven in speaking in broad tones, prior to the exile in Babylon, when you read the prophets, you read about a major problem that the Judeans had, and that major problem was investing themselves in temple ritual without obeying the laws that God gave to Moses. So what we have occurring in the exile is the emergence of a new emphasis. Slowly but surely, the Israelites or the Judeans rebuild their religious platform as a people and build it not around temple ritual because they don't have one, but they rebuild it around emphasizing the law of Moses. Now, we don't have literary information of any consequence in the Babylonian years that allow us to talk informatively about that. But clearly the genius of, or one of the evidences of the genius of the Jews is their ability to overcome a radically new religious situation and formulate a new response. And that new response would serve them in amazing ways because for the next 2,500 years, they will be a people, perhaps the only people in the world, who survive without a country. They, for 2,500 years, they managed to have a national identity in exile. This is a formative period. No doubt it forced them to turn their attention towards what we call the biblical text. There's no evidence, of course, that they had at that time been able to create a Bible for the simple reason that there were no books. Scrolls were large and cumbersome, and to have a document the size of the Old Testament was not possible. But it seems like in the Babylonian exile, they shifted from temple to text, from ritual to law. So this was a very formative time, and unfortunately we can't speak to it in any kind of meaningful way. So instead, we will take a brief glance at this Neo-Babylonian period through the great Nebuchadnezzar. Many of the inscriptions detail the prolific building efforts of this amazing king in Babylon. Much of what Herodotus, the famous Greek historian, said about the city in 460 was a result of Nebuchadnezzar's efforts. He also conducted an aggressive building program in other parts of Babylonia as well. It appears that he was consciously mirroring the precedents of great kings before him. This archaizing is characteristic of the entire Neo-Babylonian period. You see, the Babylonians saw themselves as a continuation of the very impressive Babylonian presence in ancient Near Eastern religious history. The last years of Nebuchadnezzar's life were obscure. We have very little documentation, and this time period when this great and very visible king becomes virtually invisible may be affirmation of what Daniel describes with Nebuchadnezzar's illness. In a paroxysm of royal hubris, Nebuchadnezzar sees himself as great, independent of God, and in the Bible he is smitten down. The average explanation for it is he struggled with the disease of bovine qualities because he ate grass like an animal. And so during that time period of illness, he is virtually missing in the pages of history. In the Bible, following the deliverance from that illness, he has a seeming awareness of the reality of God and humbles himself. And of course, that is in harmony with the way kings should think. So, Nebuchadnezzar shows himself to be a man of great courage, of great energy. He's known for his military victories, but he's actually should be better known for his tremendous building activities in the great city of Babylon. When you travel in this part of the world today and you visit that site of Babylon, most of what your eye sees is remains of what Nebuchadnezzar had built. So he was a great king, mentioned, of course, in Daniel, but we will move on, and we will move on to one of the most obscure kings that we will talk about, Nabonidus. Nabonidus is difficult to explain because he does not get good print in Mesopotamia. He is regarded by some to be crazy. He had a unique fidelity to the moon god Sin. Evidently, he saw the destruction of the holy city of Haran in the wars between the Egyptians and the Babylonians. He saw that as evidence that the moon god Sin was unhappy at being abused and ignored. So he rebuilt the temple of Sin, where his mother had previously been a devotee. He installed his daughter as the priestess of Sin at Ur. Then he built a great city and temple to Sin in the desert oasis of Tema in Arabia. I think I have Tema here so that you can see the location of this site. For a decade or more, he abandoned his throne in Babylon and he moved out into this desert area of Tema. And there he had built a very large temple to the moon god Sin. And he built, it's an oasis in that spot. And there he built a great city wall around Tema. Now, you know, it's hard to find ways to describe this to you, but Tema was an oasis. It wasn't an urban center. And yet, he built a wall around Tema large enough for a powerful city. So, this is some of the strangest behavior of any king in all of antiquity. How can we explain the fact that he abandoned his throne, he left the throne for his son Belshazzar, he abandoned his throne in Babylon? We're not sure if he ever went back. There's some debate about that. And he took up residence in Tema, where he builds a great temple to Sin and builds a great wall around the city. How on earth is this to be explained? And I'm pretty sure I can say to you, no one has any clear explanation for what was going on. And as is the case, there are varying attempts at explaining these strange behaviors. One of those that I think has a high level of likelihood of being at least partially true is what I call the devotee view. In other words, the behavior of Nabonidus was the behavior of a religious asceticist. he was uniquely devoted to the moon god Sin. And so he desired, perhaps in this thought, he desired to absent himself from Babylon. Now, it wasn't that there were no temples to Sin in Babylonia, but there was almost certainly political controversy between the religious functionaries in Babylon who focused on Marduk, as opposed to Nabonidus, who was focusing on Sin. And so perhaps it was to avoid that controversy and to devote himself without hindrance to Sin that he absented himself and went and lived at this oasis for 10 or more years, absent from Babylon. I think there's some value to this view. It may, however, not fully explain his actions. And so that has led to other attempts to explain his strange behavior. And so a second attempt is what has been called the religio-political view. And this religio-political view is making the point that Babylon's chief deity is the deity Marduk. Marduk is not worshipped in the West, especially among the Arabs and the Arameans. So when we say West, what we're making reference to is anything to the west of the Euphrates, all the way down to here, the whole western half of the empire, Marduk is not worshipped. So this view is making the suggestion that Nabonidus was perhaps trying to unify his country around an old prestigious deity like Sin. Now, that has some intriguing aspects to it, even if we admit that we cannot prove it. Because if there is a deity that is worshipped throughout the Fertile Crescent, it would be the moon god Sin. Some scholars think that Mount Sinai was called Mount Sinai because of the moon god Sin. We know that the great city of Jericho in Israel was so named after the moon god, Yarik. We know that to both the Arameans and to the Arabs, the whole western half of the ancient world preferred the moon god Sin. So this view is arguing that perhaps what Nabonidus was trying to do was by absenting himself from Babylon and moving to this, turning this into a religious center that could unite the Fertile Crescent power of Babylon under the religious flag of the moon god. It's intriguing, or at least to me it's intriguing, but it is also difficult to say with any degree of certainty. For example, it doesn't necessarily explain why he absented himself for 10 whole years. He could have done this sort of thing from any place in the Fertile Crescent. It doesn't explain necessarily why he would have built a gigantic wall around a few palm trees. It doesn't necessarily explain why he would build a gigantic temple to Sin in a place where there weren't very many humans to use it. So, while there may be some value to this, we would want to be careful to say no one view seems to explain adequately this or completely this somewhat unusual behavior. There is a third view that I mentioned in my class notes here, and that third view is what I call the geoeconomic view. From the years 560 to 485, Babylonia had experienced a ruinous inflation of over 200%. In other words, economically, things were not going real well back in Babylonia. Inflation was high, the economy was not strong. And so this view suggests that what he was trying to do was to recreate trade routes that could reformulate the center, the economic center of the Babylonian Empire. What this view is trying to argue is that he was trying to create an economic trade transfer that put less emphasis on Babylon and more emphasis on the western half of the empire. Well, in the last years of the reign of Nabonidus, we have a good reason explaining why they had ruinous inflation. In those last years, if you look at the salmon-colored area above Babylonia, what you can tell is that in the last years, the Medes and the Persians had succeeded in conquering in a gigantic arc so that Babylonia was cut off in every direction except the west. So it's plausible that Nabonidus was trying to formulate an economic response to the emerging power from the east called Medo-Persia. So as we look at his behavior, we say, we are not sure that we can explain why he did what he did. But what we can say is that he is not nearly as famous in the Bible as his son Belshazzar, because Belshazzar is ruling on the throne back in Babylon. We're not sure if Nabonidus had fully abdicated and Belshazzar was the exact king, or if Belshazzar was co-regent. It's not exactly clear, but what is clear is that Nabonidus wasn't ruling in Babylon and Belshazzar was. And of course, the book of Daniel has made Belshazzar famous, and so Belshazzar is ruling the city when we read the story in Daniel that Belshazzar orders a banquet. It's not controversial for a king to order a banquet. After all, kings had a lot of time on their hands. You read a book like Esther, and the entire book seems to be punctuated with various banquets thrown by the king. So he throws a banquet, and in the banquet, Belshazzar orders that the vessels from the temple. Now you might remember this is the Jewish temple, and when it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, he had brought back the religious vessels that were used in temple worship. Probably he took with him into captivity the Ark of the Covenant, and so he orders those to be brought out as drinking vessels. Well, there in the middle of the party, God intervenes and suddenly begins to write in a divine hand upon the wall the cryptic words Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And this would definitely rearrange the mood of a party. They went from a banquet of the doomed to a banquet of the terrified. I say doomed because it's not at all visible to the readers of the book of Daniel. It's not visible that Babylon was under siege and had been under siege for over a year by the Persian forces. So the banquet is a banquet thrown while the forces are besieging the city of Babylon. And there we have this handwriting, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And here in this, Belshazzar wants to have this interpreted. Now, this isn't cryptic to read. The words are easy enough. It's Mene, numbered. Tekel. Tekel is Aramaic for shekel. Shekel means weighed. So it's numbered, weighed, and separated. Upharsin. So Daniel has a reputation as a religionist. So Daniel is brought in, and Daniel interprets the writing. He doesn't translate it. Anybody knew what it was saying. He interprets it. And what he tells them is, Belshazzar, your days are numbered. Your behavior is weighed out. And you are going to be separated from your kingdom. And this is, in their world and in their language, friends, they loved puns. And this is the word from which this is the root from which we get the word Pharisee. Pharisees mean separated ones. And so separated out is the meaning of the word here, but it's also a homonym for the word Persian. If you look at the consonants, you can see that the consonants are the same. So in essence then, what the dream is telling Belshazzar, you're going to be separated out, and the Persians will be the ones who will do it. So it's a wordplay on the homonym Persian and Pharisee. So with that very night, the city of Babylon falls, and Belshazzar is removed from the throne, and the Neo-Babylonian period, just like that, comes to an end. Of course, you'll remember what I mentioned to you about these highly centralized political entities. And so these highly political entities, they collapse as suddenly as they appear. And so with the Persians having already conquered territory now in the northern part of Babylonia, all that's really left for them to do is to capture the city of Babylon, and that, of course, is what happens here. And just like that, the Medo-Persians inherit the Fertile Crescent. And so now we shift from a map that looks like that to the map that we told you about the other day, a map in which we have the largest landmass empire in the world. So we will shift our attention, therefore, for the first time in history, away from the Fertile Crescent, and we will shift it toward the east. It's so easy for us to forget that the Persian Empire is the first empire in the world not to be based on an empire of the Fertile Crescent. So, long before there was a Persian Empire, there had been occupation and artifactual evidence from sites in the 5th and 4th millennium BC. The most famous of these cities on the great Iranian plateau was Susa and Elam. By the beginning of the 1st millennium, a people called Aryans, now 1st millennium would be like 1000. So by about 1000 BC, these Aryan peoples had begun to immigrate or migrate into the area. After the migration had been accomplished, it appeared that there were 5 great tribes, of which the Parsua and the Madai were the greatest, the Medes and the Persians. But there were other tribes of consequence. The Parthava gave to the world the Parthian Empire, which during the Roman period was the greatest opponent to Rome in the entire Eastern Mediterranean. So the Parthava was a tribe. As a matter of fact, at Pentecost, in the book of Acts, we read that there were Jews from Parthia present at Pentecost. Then we have the Arachosians and the Bactrians. And so these are the 5 tribes of the so-called Persian peoples. The Medes, the Persians, the Parthians, the Arachosians, and the Bactrians. So I'm not sure if we can see those names here, but if we can show you where they're at. So the Medes are located up here in the northern part of Medo-Persia. The Persians are located in the southern part. Here are the Bactrians over here. Here is Arachosia here. And here is Parthia in the middle. So these 5 great tribes filled up this region to the east. And so for the first time now in history, political power shifts away from Mesopotamia to the east. As a matter of fact, the irony is that even though for millennia, the only center for power in the ancient world was Mesopotamia, with the shift of power to the east, this represents the last time that the center of power would ever be Mesopotamia. Because when the power shifts from the east, it will shift to the west in the person of Alexander the Great, and then in the people of the Roman Empire. So what has just occurred is an epoch in history of consequence so important that it's hard to explain to you what all this meant. So quickly, as we begin to draw near to the end of this hour, let me tell you, the center of world history was always the Fertile Crescent. With the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Fertile Crescent will never be the center of power again. From here on in, power will shift its way away from the Fertile Crescent, first to the east, then to the west. And thus it continues to this very day. When you look at this region now, you would want to perhaps call it the empire that perished. All of those empires are gone. The land is a fraction of what it had been. The land has suffered great ecological harm. There has been global drying out. So this historic region, which was fertile and powerful, has now begun the undisputable decline from which it will never recover, and now the power will shift here to the east. And this east is a dramatic change for our interests, because these Aryans are not Semites, they're Indo-Aryans. And that doesn't mean that we can tell you exactly where they came from when they immigrated. But what we can tell you is they are not Semites. They do not have a historic religion. Their language is not Semitic, it is Medo-Persian. Their culture is not Semitic. Their worldview is not Semitic. So we have the change not just of geopolitical consequences, but of religious and cultural considerations. This is an epochal moment in history. It will take us to the Persian Empire, which lasts several centuries, and is an empire of a unique consequence. So the unity of these tribes took a period of time to occur, centuries to be exact. And it first appeared under the domination of the tribe of Media. Subsequent kings, of course, after they were united, were prominent in the fall of Assyria. The relationship of these two tribes was somewhat harmonious right up until the rise of the great Cyrus, who made things a bit nervous for the Median kings. So I think what we will do is stop here and then come back in the next tape and talk about one of the, I think, truly most intriguing individuals of all of ancient history. He's called Cyrus the Great. He's a king unlike any other king in all of antiquity, and he's a joy to talk about. So we will stop here and then begin on our next tape shortly.
This is Dr. Don Fowler in his teaching on Old Testament backgrounds. This is session number 21, Neo-Babylonian Empire and End of Judah.